In a recent video, I reviewed the new Chaos Legionnaires box, and during that, I talked a little about the damage profiles the fighters had, along with some average damage calculated by the Warcry stats hammer tool. I found this useful to gauge which of the build options in the box I would prefer. But looking back, I can see that it didn't really give any idea what the warband was like. That's because the numbers were sitting in a vacuum without any context. To resolve this, and for future videos, today we're going to have a look at fighter characteristics to understand what they mean, what values would be typical. That way, when we look at the next faction, we'll have a better idea of how their damage compares, what they'd expect to kill, and what could kill them. Core stats for a fighter are move, toughness, and wounds characteristics. Second block is for a weapon. A fighter can have multiple weapons but can only attack with one in an action. We have the weapon symbol, range, number of dice, the strength, and then the hit and crit damage characteristics. At the top of the card we have the points value. An additional element worth mentioning is that each fighter is another model you can activate. So you can get them on an objective or have them carrying treasure. Just being a body has value all by itself. Okay, first up, let's talk about movement. In this plot, I've grouped the fighters based on points values. So we can see the 0 to 50 has a tiny number of models, then 55 to 100, and so on. Don't worry, there are no 102 point models missing, they all jump by 5 points. We can see across almost all points values, movement 4 is normal. Only at the high point levels does this break down where we start to see more 10 move fighters appear. These typically are mounted units. This suggests to me that all fighters start at 4 and get tweaked from there. Typically, this seems to be for flavor reasons, so you'll often see dwarfs and undead at movement 3, but with higher damage or toughness to try and make up for that. Based on this, we can declare 3 move to be slow, 4 to be typical, and 5 or better to be fast. Why does this matter though? And why are Warcry players so obsessed by movement? Warcry board is 22 by 30 inches, relatively small but typical for GW skirmishes these days. The number of turns in the game can vary, but typically you're looking at 4 turns. Assuming your fighter starts on the board on turn 1, they have a total of 8 actions in the game. If they start at a board corner, that's 18.6 inches to the center. Now they can be within 3 inches of that, but must be wholly within that. So that pushes the center down to about 15.5 inches. Now I'm looking at the center because that's where a lot of the action tends to be focused, but they could equally be perfectly in position already, or you might need them at the opposite side of the board. Either way, they'll have to spend a few turns getting into position before any other stats matter. Faster fighters will get there sooner, saving actions. The difference between a move 3 and a move 5 fighter making those 15 inches is 2 actions, which is an entire turn, which is a quarter of the game. Depending on the mission type, you may need to carry treasure, be beside objectives, or be in a certain zone to win the game, so movement can be important for this. In addition, movement determines your threat range, how far you can go in a single action, so your second action can be an attack. In this case, the first model can only move 4 inches, so it'll be outside of melee range for the target. The other fighter, however, can move 5 inches, so he's able to get within that 1 inch melee range and attack. In this case, that 1 inch of movement directly translates into actual damage, so no wonder it's so important. The next value to look at is toughness. Here we can see toughness 4 is the most common value across all groups apart from the 55 to 100 range, where it's beaten by toughness 3. As points go up, there are better chances to get higher toughness, but typically you're expecting 4 toughness. Even at the low end, where 3 toughness is more common, for every 3 fighters with 3 toughness, you get 2 with toughness 4. So I think it's pretty fair to assume 4 is the baseline. When looking at toughness, it's also worth looking at strength. During an attack, if the attacker is stronger, they hit more often. If the attacker is weaker, then hits are harder to come by. Cheap fighters favor 3 strength, while everything over 150 favors strength 4. Pretty straightforward. Okay, here's something with a little bit more meat. The amount of wounds a fighter has is relative to the number of points you spent on them. This is a roughly linear relationship within a band. So in this plot you can see, around the 150 mark you'd expect to have 20 wounds. Canaria is below that with only 10, while the Kosargi Night Guard is well above at 30. These variations of 10 are probably at the more extreme ends. Similarly, you can see the Arcanaut is at 12 wounds for 50 points, or you can pay 70 for Giant Rat with 4 wounds. At an estimate, I'd say about 6 wounds per 50 points is the average. Next, let's have a look at how the damage system works. And we're going to do this so we can actually get an average damage. So here we can see the weapon profile and the target's toughness. From this, we're going to get an estimated average damage. We do this by working out what the damage for each dice individually is. Then we can multiply that by the number of dice to get the average damage per action. If strength is greater than toughness, then 3, 4, and 5 will be hits and will do damage. A 6 will always do crit damage, which in this case is 4. If we wanted to work out average damage, we'd add up all of the hits and the crit, then divide by the number of sides, which is 6. So this gives a 1.7 damage per dice with some rounding. Then multiply by the number of dice, here 4, and you get the total average damage of the attack. So 1.7 per side, 4 dice, that's 6.7 damage on average, again with some rounding. Obviously you can never do 6.7 damage. With 4 dice, the only possible numbers you can do are all increments of 2, all the way up to potential high roll of 4 crits doing 16 damage. These numbers should all be taken with a grain of salt, but it does give us something to compare. Now, if strength is equal to the target's toughness, then 4s and 5s hit. And if strength is lower than the target's toughness, then only 5s will hit. Obviously the 6s are still crits. So sometimes you'll just be rolling hoping to get crits. Key part from all of this is you don't need lots of strength, you just need enough. We saw earlier that the typical toughness is 3 or 4, and the same for strength. In the next few examples, I'm going to look at the damage against a toughness 4 target. But when you're looking into fighters, it's also worth considering what the average damage looks like against a toughness 3 and a 5+ target. Okay, here's a distribution of damage. It's kind of interesting. We don't have a band like we had with the wounds characteristic. Instead, this is more of a shotgun scatter, with the variance increasing as the points get bigger. From the trend line in black, you'd expect 2 average damage from 75 point fighters, 3 from 100 points, 4 from 150 points, maybe 5+ from 200. Given all the nice fighters above the trend line, this feels a little low though. This in part may be due to the more expensive models often having multiple attacks, with ranged attacks having less options. Here we can see the list of only attacks with range 4 or more. Almost all are below the trend line, dragging the average down. I suspect we could up the trend line slightly for a more aggressive line, which I've added in red. Now 50 points is about 2 damage points, 100 points roughly 4, 155 and 200 points are 6 or 7. A small adjustment, but we're probably more likely to play the higher damage units, so this is maybe closer to reality. We do have to be careful with this though. In this plot, all the move 3 or less fighters have been marked in red. As you can see, a lot of them are high damage within their bracket, including a few outliers. But how useful will they be if you can't actually get them in combat? Alright, those are all the stats. Let's try pull it together a little. We found wounds has a roughly linear scale, at about 3 for every 25 points. Move and toughness are typically 4 regardless of points cost. Each fighter will have a perk or 2 beyond the baseline, maybe a few extra points of toughness or move, maybe a few more hit points or a range attack. Similarly, they can have a floor too, often in combination with perks to try and manage what seems to be a fighter budget. For a cheap fighter, let's say in the range 40 to 80, you can expect 8 or 10 wounds, 4 move, 3 or 4 toughness, doing roughly 2 damage on attack versus toughness 4. Strength will typically be 3, so a lot of the time they'll be hitting on 5s and fishing for crits on 6s. In the next range of 85 to 120 points, you can expect 15 wounds, 4 move, 4 toughness, doing roughly 4 damage in attack versus toughness 4. Strike will typically be 4, making it more effective against lower cost 3 toughness fighters. I suspect there's a pool of options the designers can play with to increase the points as they go. This Blood Warrior is pretty plain, but he doesn't have any weak points, and has a rune mark giving him access to a bonus ability. At 125 to 200 points, wounds go up again, with the linear scale, typically 20 or 25 wounds. We have 4 move, 4 toughness, and it's doing roughly 5 damage in attack versus toughness 4. This Slaughter Priest seems to have 2 perks, the option of a ranged attack and an above the curve wounds. And here we can see the 3 fighters on the plot for wounds. The Clear Blood and the Blood Warrior are just above the trend line, with the Slaughter Priest a good 6 or so wounds higher than expected. For damage, the Clear Blood and Warrior are just about on the adjusted trend line, while the Slaughter Priest is under that and just above the initial average. Hopefully that was some help. And now we'll have a better idea of how to evaluate new fighters when they come along. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and comment.